morning, everybody. All right, we're gonna get started because I actually think we have an hour, but my guess is that this is a burning topic that people are gonna have a lot of questions for our speakers. So I want to jump right in and get things started. So first of all, thank you everybody for coming quite early. I think a lot of people are bleary-eyed because I saw a lot of you at the bar late into the morning hours. So do appreciate you guys getting here so early. So what we're going to cover today, it's going to be a focused discussion on AI and the power of AI for our business. What are some of the opportunities? What are some of the pitfalls? What do we need to watch out for? And what are the things that we should really be thinking about when it comes to AI? So we are joined today by a number of esteemed speakers from the agency perspective, from the corporate perspective, and then from really the tech industry perspective. So you're gonna hear a lot of different points of view. So please, I encourage you all, jot down questions. We're gonna leave about 30 minutes for Q&A. So want to make sure that we're just addressing all of your questions. So to get things started, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes setting the context for this. You know, it's interesting because you hear about AI in our day-to-day lives. I was reading an article this morning about Sharp has come out with an AI-enabled litter box for cats, where it basically tells you the health status of your cat based on what it deposits into the litter box. And it's amazing that in this day and age, right, there's so much technology that is supposed to make our lives easier. But then there's also this fear of like Terminator and robots taking over the world and what will happen to us. And I am truly of the belief that when it comes to this industry, AI and robots and automation will not replace us. PR is about relationships, building relationships with those stakeholders and those communities that matter to our business. And that part of it will never go away. What will happen is we will be able to be better communicators. We will be better storytellers. If you think about the ability to harness all of that data and tell better stories with messages and things that your audiences actually care about. You're going to see how people are reacting to messages, what are they engaging with, that helps you create that content to maximize the potential of that outreach. It makes us more efficient. If you think about, in this day and age, as experts in analytics, we can spend a lot less time getting the data right and cleaning the data. We can rely on these systems to do that for us. We can actually use then our abilities to think about the data, draw the insights from the data, and do it in a much faster and more efficient way. And ultimately make better business decisions. You know, in a day and age where it's all about ROI and getting the most out of every dollar that you're spending, it will allow us to make much smarter, much more strategic decisions and maximize everything that we are doing out in the marketplace. That said, there are some limitations. AI is only as good in this industry as the data that is going into it. So making sure that we are using it and inputting the right data so that we can get the right models out of it. Modeling loads of data that actually doesn't matter, or data that could be incorrect, or data that could be tainted, doesn't actually help us do our job any better. We have to spend more time cleaning things and fixing things than it gives us the potential to maximize impact. There's also, there's anxiety around data and privacy. I know that this afternoon there's going to be a talk on GDPR. We cannot get through this session without mentioning Cambridge Analytica and everything that has gone on there. And that, you know, it is our job as the experts in analytics to make sure that we are taking the right steps and doing the right things with the handling of data, how we're using data, and how we're thinking about things. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Allyson Hugley from Weber Shandwick. As I mentioned, please jot down questions. We really want this to be an interactive session when we get through the speakers so that we can answer your burning questions as it relates to AI and PR.
I will admit that I struggled in writing this deck. So I lead analytics for Weber Shandwick. We've been doing a lot of experimentation with AI, and Barry is a master of management, and so we had talked about timelines weeks out for getting our decks prepared. But frankly, every day there's a new development and a new news story specific to AI. So I spent the evening just catching up to make sure I hadn't missed anything. So for example, we now have MIT, thank you, they're always doing interesting things in AI, where they can now have X-ray vision so they can actually see through walls. It will not display you as a human. It looks something like stickman warriors. But the idea that we're progressing with this technology to ways that potentially have the impact to infringe upon our privacy, infringe upon our view of where we feel we are protected and in safe spaces. There's as much an implication from the data and analytics side of this in terms of how we analyze the data to how the technology is applied and how we have to be better resources to our colleagues on the front lines of communications to talk about responsible stewardship in terms of how we apply this technology. A couple of interesting kind of fast facts about artificial intelligence. It is 2018. We are at the 50-year anniversary of the release of Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey and the introduction of HAL, which was the heuristic programmed algorithm, computer algorithm, basically HAL, and the idea that they had a system that was able to get a ship into Jupiter but could not process and distinguish between a lie, and ultimately that disconnect caused him to take a human life and almost to take another. A fascinating story, but when we think about how Mary Elizabeth started her talk with AI as friend or foe, we have to think about the fact that what we're programming and the technology that we're creating is not going to process the world in the same way that we do. And ultimately, that is the risk. It's how are we being responsible stewards in the development of this technology to make sure that ultimately the decisions that are made are going to be towards the human benefit and not detriment. Even the examples that she showed between the health robot that was in the Disney movie, which I'm blanking on the title, and Terminator. I'm sorry? Thank you, Big Hero 6. That robot was created for a benign purpose. Terminator was created as a war machine, and we have to think about what is the balance and the purpose through which we're applying this technology, whether it's in a military or a political sense, or how we're navigating the space as communicators. I think we oftentimes enter these spaces with a broad view that technology will be in the public good, and when we look at the recent incidents with Facebook, et cetera, we sometimes underestimate the ability for these technologies to go wrong. So that's enough on my soapbox. In terms of our journey, and I've heard the term journey used a lot over the course of the past day in talking about artificial intelligence, over the course of our journey, it's been incredibly interesting the role that machine learning and the need to train systems has had on the relationships within the agency between the digital technologists that are developing new pieces of tech to bring forward communications and support our programs, and the analysts. So the analyst teams, historically being viewed as a measurement function or an insight function, are now becoming increasingly fully integrated into teams. And we are talking increasingly about the benefit to the agency being more sophisticated services, data-first digital solutions, this idea that what we're bringing to market is data-infused, not just data-driven or data-informed. And we really are seeing artificial intelligence is coming, but where we see a lot of the attention is on machine learning and the role that analysts are playing in actually training a lot of these systems to make sure that they're going to operate effectively and deliver the returns. So that future forward of analytics from our perspective is much more about data and quants being fully integrated into the communications process and being part of the development of new technologies and solutions. Another aspect that we're looking at from an artificial intelligence perspective or machine learning is just the overall analytics opportunity. So this is data from Gartner, but showing that a significant portion of CMO budgets are going to be dedicated to analytics. We expect, or it's projected, that the amount of resource dedicated to the acquisition of data is only going to increase, but we're still seeing companies use less than 1/3 of the data that they have for business decisions. There's the opportunity for agents as consultants and stewards, whether you're in-house or at an outside agency supporting your clients, is leveraging this technology to convert that data exhaust, if you will, into actual assets. There's about 2/3 of data that's not being utilized, and if we can help turn that into business advantage, it changes the dynamics of the relationship and the conversation, and that's something that we're very much focused on. So again, measurement used to be an add-on aspect of the business. It was something that was intended to deliver and improve our impact. Now it is about how do we drive the business forward and how do we use this as opportunity to create new products and new solutions in the space, really changing the nature of the conversation and the value that an agency can bring. Competitive advantage. In 2007, competing on analytics came out, and it was the whole idea that you could use predictive modeling and analytics to achieve differentiation, distinction in the marketplace. That has completely shifted now to a conversation around competing on the tech. The idea that machine learning is going to be the new proving ground for intelligence. What that means from a data and analytics training perspective is that it's not just enough to know about the statistics. You actually need to know a lot more about the tech, and not just conceptual knowledge, but actually hiring and staffing much differently in terms of looking for people with real deep quant skills and computer science skills to be able to build out the infrastructure that's going to allow for the data integration and the mining. So the dynamics in terms of what an agency or a company needs to be competitive from a data perspective, even in the communication space, I think for quite some time that's been true in finance and logistics, et cetera. But in terms of competing, even on the messaging, it's going to be increasingly a question of both quantitative skills but also technical skills. MIT puts out, I think, the most in this area in terms of pieces worth reading. So pulling from that white paper that I just showed, machine learning really being about faster insights. And I think we've talked about this, but this is just to put some additional quantitative data against some of the points that have been raised throughout the past day or so. But the idea of what the expectation is for what machine learning will deliver against what people are actually seeing or companies are actually seeing in terms of return. The idea that more extensive data analysis and insights are possible, that's actually the tightest gap, and it's the #1 priority. We see here again this idea of competitive advantage, but I think that is the most sizable gap between that 46% and 26%, which is that there's still a waiting to see the delivery on those returns. And in fact, getting machine learning to work really effectively is actually a lot more time intensive than most people assume currently. And so that still requires a significant amount of investment in resource to develop the algorithms, to then continue to refine them around specific vertical needs. So the competitive advantage is still a gap. Faster data analysis, again, is a little bit tighter. Enhancing R&D, improved efficiency, which Mary Elizabeth talks about, and also cost reduction. But again, this idea of being able to do more extensive data analysis, more quickly integrate your data sets is huge. With respect specifically to artificial intelligence, we've done some research at Weber Shandwick. A couple of key stats: 7 in 10 CMOs report that their company is doing some planning for AI in the area. As a communicator or an evaluator of communications, the idea of being tuned in to how the business narrative is changing, what it is presenting in terms of potential risks and opportunities that we have to help clients navigate is increasingly important. Also, when we think about the implications of the shifts in terms of what is going to impact and drive the business of communications going forward. So the fact that more than half are saying that AI will have a greater impact on marketing and communications and social media is huge when we think about how social media has transformed our industry from a measurement perspective, from a creation of communities and engaging with stakeholders. It bears a lot of thought and pause in terms of how we're going to take advantage of this opportunity and continue to navigate the space in both a smart but also responsible way. I think the human implication, because Mary Elizabeth also flagged, sorry, I'm not sure where she went, the idea that we are humans and that what we do is public relations and we can't be replaced, it's a human creative exercise. By 2020, it is projected that 85% of consumer interactions will be handled without a human agent. I think this is an interesting stat when we marry that with another recent piece in the news around the CEO of LinkedIn talking about one of the skills that employees are lacking more now is the interpersonal skills. While we are becoming more tech savvy and while we are looking at the acceleration and advancement of artificial intelligence, we are losing some of our human dynamics. And I think if we are looking at that to anchor our differentiation when competing against artificial intelligence, we need to strike a better balance, and we need to make sure that we're actually as differentiated as we think. Not only are we losing our ability for strong human interactions or having high levels of interpersonal skills, there's also research now that's talking about the fact that our IQs are diminishing. So when we talk about the emphasis of artificial intelligence and how our computers are getting smarter, we in fact are becoming less skilled at personal interaction and less intellectual. So it's something to think about in terms of, are we going to be as different from the technologies that we're developing? There's also a lot happening in terms of creative exercises, demonstrating that you can create and develop creative content using artificial intelligence. So MIT, again, this was their Shelley project. This is, for the past 2 years, they've put out content around Halloween. It's a riff off of Mary Shelley, but it's basically they ingested into a machine learning system a whole host of horror stories, and then let Shelley run and to create her own piece of content. At the end of the day, there's still a lot of refinement that needs to happen, but the idea that computers will not be able to create, and many of them are currently, effective press releases or effective white papers, et cetera, it is in fact possible, and that technology is not as far off as we think. The question is, again, how do we develop and refine these systems, and how do we continue to play a responsible human role with respect to what they produce? They've also done this with visual content. So I think a lot of conversation around machine learning and the role that it plays with text analysis and development of text-based content, but it's also happening in the visual space. So not only is AI able to create images like this, but it's also, I'm sure you've seen it in the news, ability to create, to replicate human imagery and voice. So when we talk about fake news having to be managed in social and in print, it's going to increasingly be part of the visual experience as well. And when we talk about how we articulate truth and how we become stewards of advancing that, it's going to only become increasingly challenging to parse truth from fiction when machine learning and technology is able to create not only a new visual reality counter to what may in fact be true, and to be able to put that into the marketplace. There are implications there in terms of switching that from not just a creative exercise to an evaluation exercise, being in position to not test after you've developed the creative, but to actually be forward-thinking and working with partners to understand what are the components of creative that work most effectively. We happen at Weve to work with a partner called Picasso Labs, but you can deconstruct the content and understand a woman in a yellow dress with a natural setting, with an overlay of an urban setting behind it, will be more effective in driving conversions than if you have a male, or if she's holding food, or she's holding a shopping bag, et cetera. So we're actually going into the creative process with a lot more resource to understand how do we actually construct the content. So less effort being put against testing once developed, more insight in the upfront to create well-constructed and effective, impactful creative going into it. There are also the darker sides, which Mary Elizabeth mentioned. So MIT, again, the thing they created most recently is called Norman. And they basically fed Norman a lot of content from a Reddit forum that was quite graphic in nature. It had a lot of maiming of human people and killing of people, a lot of disturbing content. Basically what happened is they created an engine that, regardless of what they showed it, would react that it was something negative. So for example, after being exposed to the Reddit forum, if it was shown an ink blot of what was supposed to be a vase of flowers, it would say that that's a decapitated man. So the idea of how responsible we need to be in training this technology and what we put into it, I would equate this to children. We ultimately will get the returns on this with what we put into it. And they are increasingly putting forward thought pieces around the idea that what is ingested in the system, the data, but also the people that are stewards for it and owning it, has a lot of impact in terms of how the AI will interpret the world. We also have a lot of the bot activity. And I think as an agency trying to understand what is true and what conversations are really being driven by humans versus bots, it's had a lot of implications on how we're evaluating our data partners. So we want to understand what are the filtering mechanisms, the bot detection mechanisms, how are you parsing content to really validate that it's a human behind it, and what are those quality controls. So I think that is incredibly important and will increasingly be a challenge as we try to find truth in the data that's being produced. The other piece that I want to call out, and I am watching the clock, I'm sorry, artificial intelligence in terms of dominating the news. There is a role that we have to play. I think there's been such a rich conversation over the past day or so as communicators, as professionals in the communications evaluation space, talking about artificial intelligence and the role that it plays in impacting our business. But the challenge is we are, in an ever-increasing conversation, a very small fraction. So when we think about our role in terms of advising our clients, in terms of risk mitigation in this space and helping them navigate all of the challenges that are presented in an increasingly automated world, a lot of this conversation is driven by tech companies. We're about 5% of AR stories are referencing PR, advertising, or communications. As a positive, Forbes had a story out last night for top 10 ways that agencies can leverage artificial intelligence, so give it a read. But the idea is that we're not visible enough in this ever-increasing conversation. There's a lot of opportunity there for us to own it and to have a role in stewardship and responsible management, because it is the next, I would argue, the next place where there's a lot of risk for our companies as well as for our clients. Dovetailing on that, not as present because it's actually one of the areas that we feel least prepared for. So it's great to have the conversation here today, but there's a lot more work to be done to kind of elevate the knowledge base within the industry relative to other aspects of tech. There's also a shift in terms of the ways that it's being applied and machine learning and artificial intelligence needing to be increasingly niche. So the idea that we've gone from sort of IBM and Watson, we're now working in the space of assisted voice technology, and then how do we then leverage open API platforms and frameworks to create custom solutions for clients? How do we train these systems, and how do we evaluate their impact? That's going to be increasingly part of the narrative, and the space is changing incredibly quickly. To sum up, it is harder than you think. So this is a great article. Please read it. I'm running short on time. But the idea is that we think we're farther along than we are. We make a lot of assumptions about what the tech can do without us. And there's a lot more thought that we need to put into the planning and the training process for these systems to be effective. So I'll share with you very quickly just some elements of the Weber-Shandwick journey in this space. The first is training. So many agencies are looking at, for example, social community management and leveraging chatbot technology to do that increasingly. You can measure for that, but you also need to train for a vast amount of intents, which means that all of your community managers need to be effective partners in the training process, and that's something that you have to think through. You have to plan out all of those scenarios and test against them so that you have the right inputs. The next piece is focus. We've also looked at leveraging artificial intelligence systems to integrate a lot of data and produce high-level insights. The challenge is that the systems, from a training perspective, don't work as effectively when you overload them. That's a key point in the New York Times article. It needs to be very focused. So instead of trying to measure the world, pick a vertical. That's why when Google launched Duplex, there were sort of 3 scenarios or intents. It was going to call a salon, order your food, et cetera. The use cases are very narrow because they're training against very specific things, and we have to keep that in mind. The last piece is the time. So even if you're working within natural language processing and you're developing those algorithms from scratch, you're not necessarily using a market or off-the-shelf solution, you actually have to create the dictionary of terms that are very specific to your vertical. That is an incredible amount of time that constantly needs to be refreshed by humans for that system to be effective. So the idea that you're going to create an engine that's going to run on its own, we're not actually there yet. There's still a lot of human time that needs to be invested to make these things work. And the idea that machine learning is equal to set it and forget it is really not true. There's a lot of human time in building out the systems, training them, and continuing to make sure they're refreshed and kept up to date. And 3 closing points really quickly. Just getting to the numbers is no longer enough. You really have to be more embedded in the tech and understand the technical sides and be more thoughtful and critical, especially when evaluating partners. What we've discovered is that some of the ML solutions that are very good at analyzing long-form content can't tackle short-form and vice versa. So you have to create pilot test, work that into your plans to be able to make sure the tools are effective. There is tremendous value to be gained from ML and AI, but focus is required. Pick your verticals, pick your spaces. If you try to do everything, it's going to be very muddy, and you're going to have so much more time invested in the training process and actually get diminishing returns. Last piece, artificial intelligence, it really can't be separated from human intelligence at this point. Machine learning is very much a human process to get to the right inputs. And I will turn it over to Omar. Sorry.
Yesterday, I took a cab in Barcelona, and I started chatting with the taxi drivers. His English was a bit broken, but we were managing. We talked about the weather, we talked about Barcelona, we talked about football. And then I made a mistake of asking him about the political situation and the independence of Catalonia. And all of a sudden he said, "I'm sorry, my English is no good." I thought that was the end of the conversation, or maybe the end of the ride. But then he took his smartphone out of his pocket and started speaking in Spanish. And I didn't understand what was going on. And then he paused, and I heard the response in English to my question. And then a conversation continued like that, and I asked him, what's this? He said, it's Google Translate. And both of us admired very much the technology that were making things easier, and he showed me the list of languages that can be used for the translation. And I think, to go back to what Allyson said and what Marie Elizabeth said about friend or foe, that's the essence of the positive aspect of artificial intelligence. It's about collaboration. It's not about competition. And I think the future will be the intelligent innovation is going to be a combination of artificial intelligence and natural intelligence. So more specifically, humans will be asking smarter questions, reframing old questions, and letting the machine do the hard work of answering those questions. This is the only equation I have. It's as technical as it gets. I'll share with you a few examples of how this is happening in reality. So when we think about data, we always think about numbers and facts. We need to change that mindset and realize that now everything is data. You're familiar, of course, with some of the body measurement. We have now machines that are tracking everything on our wrists, on our eyes. Our heartbeat is data, our temperature is data. And now, a very interesting example is dreams. We talked yesterday about insights. And if you think about it, we're spending 1/3 of our life sleeping and dreaming. But when we wake up, 95% of the dreams are forgotten within 5 minutes. Now there is an app and machines that can help us identify what's happening in our dreams. It's basically an escalating alarm, so it doesn't wake you all of a sudden. It keeps increasing, and you stay accordingly in what is called hypnopompic state, and that allows you to recall your dreams better. And the machine will actually prompt you to input your dream, either by typing or by speaking. Now, yesterday we talked a lot about insights. Think about the insights you can get from that. It's not just about an individual dream. You can look at the pattern, the trend. Are there repeated words or repeated images that are happening in your dreams? Is there a trend changing over time? How do your dreams compare to other people's dreams? Think about segmentation. Think about targeting. Clicks and searches. We'll look at that more closely. Talking about dreams, again, I like this quotation attributed to Freud. Once you start making Freudian slips, it's just one thing after a mother. You know, Freud was always referring things, regressing them to childhood and the role of our parents, especially our mothers. So I think there is a well of information in our dreams and in our sleep. There's a very good book called Everybody Lies. It's written by an ex-Google analyst. And he's saying that people are always lying. When you talk to people, they lie. In surveys, people lie. Even in social media, people lie and always portray a more positive image. But when they search, they don't lie, especially on sensitive topics. So if you're looking into politics, race, sex, it's better to look at searches, what people are searching, not what they're saying. So for example, during the latest elections between Hillary Clinton and Trump, people were asked whether you're going to vote or not. And the claims about voting did not match what happened in reality. But when you looked at searches by how to vote and where to vote, that was predictive of whether people were going to vote or not. In fact, if you want to get people to do something, don't ask them if they're going to do it or not. Ask them where and how they're going to do it, because that implies an intention. In race, again, no one will say I'm a racist, but if you look at the searches, you can see the trends and how this is affected by current events. In sex, for example, when you ask people about sex frequency claims, and then based on that, you predict the number of condoms that are being sold, you get into 1.6 billion. But when you look at reality, it's much lower. People overclaim, especially men. Actually, if you compare men's and women's data, it doesn't match. I know there are other explanations for that, but enough on sexy. Words are data. The words that you use can tell you also which target group you belong to. For example, conservatives will talk about homosexual marriage, and liberals will talk about same-sex couples. Other things like reforming Social Security versus privatizing Social Security. The words matter. An interesting example was a campaign on tax reduction by the Republicans, and they talked about tax cuts. And the campaign was not successful. And they brought in psychologists and linguists to see what's happening. And they found it's about the words. When you think metaphorically about the word cut, it has negative connotations. So they changed the campaign without changing the facts and talked about tax relief. And that had a very positive impact on the campaign. If you look at historical trends, if you start from, for example, 1800 until 2000, were people referring to the United States as United States is or the United States are? The red line is the United States are. So in 1800, people didn't get used to this as one country. They were looking at them as separate states. So they were saying the United States are. And you see the red line declining, and the blue one, which is the United States, is growing. So again, you can do the analysis on different historical periods and see what social cultural trends are taking place. You probably all know Stephen Hawking. I think most of us don't understand his cosmology and quantum physics discoveries. And he was aware of that, and he wanted his voice to reach the public. So he decided to write a book that you can buy at airports. And he wrote A Brief History of Time. It's a good book. It's not technical, but it got the reputation of being the most started and unfinished book. And that was anecdotal. You couldn't really measure it, but I can testify. I started also and I couldn't finish it. It gets difficult when you understand one concept and then use it to explain another concept. It gets difficult after a while. Now, thanks to the technology, we can quantify this measure. So now there's something called the Hawking Index that tracks on ebooks how much of a book you highlight. So if on average the highlighting stops at 20%, you say the Hawking Index is 20%. You see here Hillary Clinton's 2%. Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a very good book by Kahneman, but it's not an easy reading. It has a 7%. Even 50 Shades of Grey only has 26%. That's about 13 shades of gray. And you see, Brief History of Time is about 7%. I think we should do something similar to presentations. Like, when do you stop paying attention? This is slide 8 out of 13, so you're 62% there. Thank you for paying attention. Tracking the past can also help us predict the future. So you can look, for example, this is done in the US, that you look at the progression of a flu and the searches about flu and cold and medication. And then pharmaceutical companies can predict where the flu is going and target their promotion and advertising communication accordingly. Natural disasters are another one. If you track the history, you can see how consumption patterns are going to change. Walmart does this very well and discovered that during hurricanes, people tend to consume certain products. Some of them are expected, like torches, for example, things you need in a natural disaster, but some were completely unexpected, like strawberry Pop-Tarts. Why strawberry Pop-Tarts during a hurricane? One explanation is it's comfort food, and also it's a food that doesn't require preparation, so it's handy for disaster. But why strawberry? They have no clue, but it works. So whenever there's a disaster now, they stock the stores with strawberry Pop-Tarts. Today, the second most important event is happening, which is the World Cup. And as you know, since Moneyball and baseball, we're taking lots of measurements of sports, including football, but artificial intelligence are allowing us now to take this to new level. So there will be more measures, almost 100 measures per second. The players will be wearing small machines, including a GPS, that's tracking their speed, their orientation, even the impact of when you hit another player, the force of a tackle. And what this does is that it improves the quality of the game, and it also creates new metrics. So for example, you calculate the workload of a player during the last 7 days compared to the last 4 weeks. And based on that, you calculate the probability of injuries. So if, for example, it's more than half, then you have a 15% chance of injury. Brazil is already implementing that, and they start to see a decline in the injuries of players. So we're going to be seeing faster game, fewer energies, and hopefully less mistakes and a better World Cup overall. So to summarize, remember, everything is data. Search and you will find. Measure what you couldn't before, like in the Hawking Index. Track past trends to predict the future events. and look for immediate feedback and history. That's where the collaboration, because now the coaches in football will be getting comments from the analysts and take immediate action. That's a great example of collaboration between machine and people. I'd like to go back to the taxi story. So after talking about Google Translate, I asked the taxi driver, what do you think of cars without drivers? He said, no, I don't like that idea. A machine can never be like a person. I said, why? He said, because a machine can never predict unexpected things. Like you see someone walking on the pavement and all of a sudden they decide to cross. The machine cannot spot that. I wasn't sure actually, but anyway, I said to him, anyway, I prefer to talk to you than to talk to a machine. He said, of course, because the machine will always be right. Whether the machine will always be right or not, I'm not sure, but I think it's a good question. So keep asking questions. Thank you.
Quickly give just a candid precursor on what my background is. I'm a startup founder with a very deep focus in human-computer interaction. What I'm not is an AI researcher, and so I'd like to make that distinction before I get started. But I did study computer science and philosophy, and specifically with an interest in the philosophy of the mind. And so as AI continues to advance, I think there are a lot of interesting ethical questions that we should at least be talking about and thinking about as not only we develop these tools, but as we use them more and more in the market. Cool. So as you might be able to guess, I personally don't have any toddlers that have been growing up in my household, or at least toddlers of my own, that have been growing up with AI personal assistants. And while this might not be a surprise to you based on my age, you probably may have your own children or know people who have toddlers that have been growing up with things like Siri or the Google Assistant in their houses, and who have grown accustomed to treating these things as if they're a member of their household. Maybe not like a brother or a sister, but definitely similar to how they may treat an animal or something along those lines. And this is not an accident. Broadly speaking, we can think about the task of creating AI as creating technology that is able to behave more human or act more human. And what I mean by that is it is the task of making computers be able to take in various inputs, analyze those inputs, and produce results that we as humans find intelligible and align with our social or commercial goals. Now, when we speak about AI, I think it's important first to draw this clear distinction between two categorically different types of AI. So you have one type of AI, which is you've all interacted with, I'm sure, which is narrow AI. And this is systems that can do very specific subsets of tasks very well, just as good as humans or even better. So think about the Amazon Alexa. It is just as good as humans, or sometimes better at taking some sort of textual information and looking up a result that you might ask it. So, like, what is the weather? The other type of AI is general AI, and this is something that has been somewhat of a moving target among AI researchers, but this is the type of system that can learn like humans. So not only can it perform a given task very well, but it can also learn about learn how to wrestle new problems that it's never encountered. So this is something that you could think about as similar to the Terminator, or if you've seen the movie Her, the personal girlfriend Samantha. And this is the type of AI that we're most often afraid of. But it also is the type of AI that is mostly science fiction. So in this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on narrow AI and the ethical concerns that I think are important, because those are the ethical concerns that are most pressing. So I'd first like to talk about the erosion of truth in our society due to the over-personalization of everything. So personalized content is not something that is new to AI. There's been, localized print media has existed since the existence of written communication. However, personalization in the past has been something that was comprehensible to humans. We could understand that if you're reading the news in Shanghai, it's going to be different than if you're reading the news in New York. And that makes sense to us as people intuitively. However, we're reaching a point in which personalization is determined by factors that are not easily recognizable by humans. If you ask the people at Facebook why you're being shown what you're being shown in your newsfeed, they admittedly cannot tell you because the algorithms are so complicated that it is becoming not possible to audit and understand in a lot of cases why we're receiving the information that we're receiving. So two people in the same city opening their Facebook feed or even opening the New York Times app on their phone are no longer reading the same New York Times and no longer consuming the same headlines. And I worry that this is contributing to what many journalists have talked about as the emergence of a post-truth time period that we're entering. Because if we can no longer go to the same sources of media and see the same things that we intuitively expecting we're sharing among the people who are in our city or in our social groups, our intuition for what truths actually exist may also erode. And so I think that the solution, or one proposed solution to this, is making it explicitly clear when content is customized and also how it is customized, because otherwise I truly fear that the intuitive existence of truths is something that we will continue to see erode. So another thing I'd like to talk about is the importance of understanding what is optimized for. I think that there is this unfortunate propensity to believe that computers are infallible, or that if you have a decision-making process that's been handed off to a computer, it's no longer can be biased, and that's simply not true. Computers can be racist. If you imagine a system where career mentors and graduating undergraduates across the nation are systematically matched, that just happens to match black students at significantly shocking lower rates than their white counterparts, despite the models being blind to race, that result would clearly be unsatisfactory. And being able to understand why the model is behaving the way it is just as important as recognizing that it is faulty. And so I'd like to point out that some AI techniques are better than others when it comes to this concern. For example, if you were to use Bayesian methods, you'd be able to understand what different factors are given different weights, as opposed to if you're using something like a deep neural net, which is what Facebook uses some variation of in their newsfeed, at which point you have really no understanding of why the output is what it is. And it becomes incomprehensible to human observers. So I think when it comes to using these narrow AI models and techniques, we should not only care about their accuracy and their scalability, but also their auditability. Granting these roles that have previously been held by humans to AI poses not only the risk of, or poses a risk of thinking that these systems are not biased in the way that we humans are, but that is simply not true. And we need to be careful not to attribute false authority to these technologies when it is not necessarily due. So there's also this idea that was posed by Alan Turing years ago about we've reached AI when AI can pass the imitation game. When a person no longer can tell if they're talking through a conversation, can no longer tell if they're talking to a person or to an AI. And we're getting very close to reaching this point. I don't know if any of you heard about Google Duplex, but it's a system that Google developed that was previously mentioned this morning that can make calls on your behalf to the barber or make appointments for you. And these technologies, or the advancement of technology to this point, is, I think, risks eroding the principles of trust and honesty that I think societies across the world all share. I think that it is important that we know when it is that we're talking to an AI or to a human being, because otherwise I think there are unintended social consequences that we might have to grapple with. For example, if you lose complete understanding of when you're interacting with the messenger bot or even over the phone, if the person you're talking to is a real person or an AI, I worry that the way we treat each other and the way that we interact with people will no longer be the same. Because I don't know if you personally have noticed this, but I talk to Siri in a way that I would never talk to my mother, my girlfriend, even a good friend that I'm comfortable being a little bit confrontational with. Siri is a tool, and I recognize that. But when we get to the point that when we're calling to make an appointment at the hair salon and we no longer can know what is a person and what is a robot on the other end, I think that we risk changing the social norms and the ways that we treat each other in a way that'll carry over into our personal relationships and possibly have some unintended and unhappy consequences. So I think the solution to this is again, really a transparency of understanding when it is that you are talking to a human or an AI. Because I think without these standards for transparency, we create the potential not only for a deterioration of trust, but also unintended changes to our social conventions. So I'd like to take really quickly just to look a little bit into the future. Many experts in AI think that general AI is something that is inevitable at some point. And general AI presents a whole new category of ethical considerations that are not necessarily important now in industry, but they're interesting things to think about. So at the point that AI becomes less of this task-oriented solution and opens up the possibility for machines that really think and experience, this is when we'll start to have to consider, do AI have moral rights? And that's kind of what I'd like to leave you with is, I guess, pointing out that this is not a consideration now, but as these systems become more and more sophisticated, eventually we have to ask ourselves, at what point do computers have autonomy, have rights? And that's a question that I think a lot of us have trouble grappling with. So thank you.
Best laid plans of 30-minute Q&A. As you can tell, there's a lot of content out there on this topic. So we're down to about 10 minutes for Q&A. But if you guys want to take a seat on the stage. And the ladies with the microphones, raise your hand if you have a question. Oh, here we go. They're coming to you with a mic.
Hi, thank you. Lots of content there, as you're rightly saying, lots of things to think about. Actually, on the ethical side, so Jacob, I wanted to pick you up on, follow on your observation around the dangers of, you mentioned different data mining models, and some of them are very opaque. And I'm conscious of, is it Cathy O'Neill wrote a book, Weapons of Maths Destruction, that kind of talked about that point, the dangers of models that actually no one knows how decisions are actually being made. And that's obviously a general problem, but it probably could also affect the communication space if AI is saying this is important or this is important, and your organizations are making really important strategic decisions based on that, and we don't quite know why that is. I was wondering if there's a way around that or what we should be careful about.
Yeah, certainly. So there are methods that are less opaque, and I think that part of the reason that deep neural nets are something that is a very popular tool to be used right now is just because that's an area of research that's been very rapidly advancing in recent years. And I'd also like to point out that using deep neural nets, using these opaque systems is not something that's always bad. I think there are certain tasks where transparency is less important. So image classification, for example, it's not super imperative to understand, why the AI understands that like a picture of a toy is a toy and a picture of a person is a person, or when scanning a road, understands why it or how it classifies what the street signs are, et cetera. But I think when we start to use AI in these contexts in which it changes kind of how we interact socially, that's where understanding the transparency is really important. So there are, like, I guess all I would say in terms of how we avoid that opaqueness, like deep neural nets are inherently opaque because the way that they operate is basically trying to create a computer simulation of the human brain. So you have kind of this deep intertwining of like virtual neurons that fire or don't fire, and based on thousands of those, at the end you get some sort of result, and you can't really go back and track why which neurons are firing. But if you use a method like using Bayesian models, which allow you to basically take different factors, so you could say, what is somebody's, what is their age, what is their median income, what is their I don't know, party affiliation, and you give those things different weightings that are then reinforcedly adjusted based on the data that you feed it. That is something that it is auditable by humans. So you can, if you notice the system is being racist, for example, you can go back and look and say, wait, even though we made it blind to race, there was actually this factor regarding where someone was born that is highly correlated with race that we should also actually be removing that from the model as well. And so I think using techniques like that where there are social concerns is something that should be thought about more.
And we have a question in the back.
I had a query in terms of, nowadays there's a lot of fake news which happens across the world. Back home in India also, it's a big peril for most of us. Do you think AI can actually detect the fake news or maybe add to the fake news? What's the relation with AI in terms of the current issue of fake news?
I think it's how it's applied. So I think there's a lot of bot activity that's involved in promoting fake news. And if we look at in the U.S., for example, our last election, there was a lot of post-election analysis on the role that artificial intelligence and bot technology played in advancing a lot of that. I think the challenge is, and it more goes back to what Jake was saying around it, there is the fake news component, but I think the fact that these systems are reinforcing behaviors and mindsets and playing into how people are consuming information, a lot of it is tied to the evolution in our human habit of not sort of getting out of a very narrow set of sources that we're using to consume content and becoming more critical in how we assess the information. So I think there's definitely a role that technology is playing, but I think there's also a reality within the human condition that we have to acknowledge as communicators, which is that we consume information differently, and the fact that the algorithms are set up to reinforce a lot of existing behaviors makes it more challenging. You can definitely deploy, and I mentioned this earlier, we look for partners that can help with bot detection. You can look for certain cues within the content and program for that to be able to surface what are the critical components or core components of fake news stories. But I don't necessarily think that that's going to solve the problem. There needs to be a change in how we are training ourselves and educating ourselves around the consumption of news. I think that's a human process, and right now we have a lot of technology-based behaviors that are reinforcing and allowing for technology to, and technologies and bad actors to kind of propagate this type of activity.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. My name is Aseem. I'm from Impact Research India. We are a small measurement firm. We have good technology skills in-house, but our AI skill set is very weak. The question I want to ask you is, when we talk to people outside and look at examples of AI being applied, do you think the term AI is being very loosely used in all examples? And the reason I ask this question is, for example, the example that Omar shared about players playing with sensors. This is something that we in our business have been doing already, using sensors to pick up data, correlating the data, and coming up with insights using all that data. Now, suddenly, you see so many examples, and loosely the word AI is sprayed all over to say there is something more that we are able to do. As a small firm, we get confused, and it's very difficult to identify who's actually using AI. Do you feel something similar, or should we be looking at it differently?
Yeah. I think you're right. The term is used loosely. I think it refers to anything that the machine is doing now that in the past only a human can do. I think there are some important differences. The first one is the machine can handle a huge amount of data. And it can compare it to other subsets of data. So you can look, for example, at segments within the population. And it mostly collects actual behavior, not attitudinal or claimed data. And it can also use past data to predict the future. So I don't think you should necessarily limit the definition of AI, but maybe be clear about what you mean by it.
Another piece, and this is similar to Omar's kind of search analysis. I actually ran an analysis similar to the news story one around big data, analytics, AI, machine learning. Actually, in search, people are looking for machine learning more so than they are for artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, I think, is playing into a little bit of clickbaiting, which is there's a lot of interest in the topic. There are news stories coming out every day. There's pressure to be part of that story and that trajectory in terms of a growing conversation in the news cycle. But I think people that are, I don't want to say in the know, but are actually looking for solutions, understand that the majority of the solutions are machine learning based versus actually being true, the broader definition of artificial intelligence. It's playing in that smaller slice.
Jacob, you're a techie. Can you tell us
sorry.
what is it that you look for in a solution to say that, yes, it crosses the threshold of getting into the AI space?
Self-teaching.
I guess I would just very quickly say it's very dependent on the techniques that are being used. So I think avoiding that overusage of the term, what I think would be better for the industry would be more frequent use of actually describing what techniques are being used. So a Bayesian model is being used, deep neural nets are being used, et cetera. I think that those all get enveloped into kind of the bubble of AI. And I think that it really is what techniques are being used that differentiates an AI technique as opposed to a more general machine learning technique. Though AI is really a subset of machine learning. So there's some good visualizations if you look online that kind of show AI as a subset of, deep neural nets are a subset of AI or a subset of machine learning. And that can kind of put things in perspective a little bit more.
Well, thank you to the panelists. We are at time. We're going to get out of this room because somebody else has to come in. So thank you to the three of you for creating all the content.